Most things are created, someone must put together a design for that creation. Before we delve into the technology of web design, we need to take a look at what design is and what separates good design from bad design. So, what is design? Design is the plan and the method that an object is created with. Any creation of any complexity needs to have some sort of plan for it to come into being. This process translates an idea into a physical form, and that's what design is. Another aspect of design is, of course, the aesthetic. Good design effectively hooks into our human sensibilities. This is what prevents things from being boring. In e-learning, I have a link to an article by John O'Nolan, a web designer from the UK, and it's a great article, and you should read that. And I love the idea in this graphic from that article that good art is a talent and good design is a skill. So while a great artist, is born with that talent, almost anybody can learn good design. It's a great thing to keep in mind when we're struggling to make something happen. So we're going to organize our discussion of design by identifying 13 design sins. This is not an exhaustive list, but it covers most of the big problems that you're likely to see in web design. First of all, things that blink. In the early days of the web, we had this abomination called the blink tag, and it did just that. It made text and graphics blink on the screen, and it was every bit of as annoying as you might imagine. Thankfully, this has been mostly killed off, but you probably have still seen it here and there on the web. Animated GIFs are another thing that blinks. And while they're fun to make, they should be used sparingly. When animated GIFs actually first started appearing on the web in the mid-1990s, we used to disparagingly call them dancing baloney. Too much motion can distract from a design, and certainly it distracts from the message of the design. So, most blinking things are used to for that purpose, actually, and that's why you often see them in ads. So, yeah, things that blink. Totally professional. Yikes. Number 2, warped photos. You should always keep photos in proportion. Humans have an innate sense of proportion, especially when it comes to the human form and face. So distorted photos are immediately distracting from any other message on the site. So don't get your graphics out of proportion when you're working with them in Photoshop or with the width and height attributes in HTML. First photo, obviously, that's President Obama. The second one is very obviously distorted horizontally, and it's easy to pick up on that. Number 3, naked photos. Nope, not that kind. Look elsewhere on the web, I guess. What we mean here is that you should use borders with photos when they have ambiguous edges. So for instance, the image on the left has no well-defined borders other than maybe the line on the bottom where the trees are cut off. The one on the right has a nice thin border to demark the edges. This prevents elements from bleeding into the image improperly. Number 4, related. We just talked about adding borders when necessary, but you also don't want to get carried away. It's best to use negative space or, to group it or separate things. Negative space is just another way of saying, parts of the design with nothing in them. Blank space, white space. So if a box is appropriate, you should use it sparingly. Heavy boxes tend to look like buttons and can really lead to frustration in your audience when they expect to see some interactivity because it looks like a button, but they find none. So don't do that. Number 5, cheated margins. Be generous with margins. Don't crowd the elements of your design. So for instance, you can see in this example how the list on the right to the right of the image is all smooshed up into the image. It makes it look crowded and cluttered, and you could really use some negative space in there to kind of separate that out so that it's cleaner. Number 6, centering everything. For the most part, you should avoid centered layouts. Centered titles and dividers are okay, but when you center text, it just looks like bad poetry. Speaking of bad poetry, here's a poem I wrote in 4th grade. Roses are red, violets are blue, your animal magnetism makes squirrels stick to you. I do not remember what grade I got on that, but at least it did not end up in yet another parent-teacher conference. Anyway, moving on. Number 7, the 4 corners and clutter. Cluttered designs are difficult to read and use, and since that's kind of the point of the web, that's really a bad thing. Avoid filling up the corners with non-content items, like in this example. You have a completely unnecessary border, redundant clip art, and, just for good measure, distorted image as well. So, that doesn't look terribly professional, but there it is. Number 8, trapped negative space. You should avoid awkward negative space in the middle of designs. You want to push negative space to the edge of the design. It's like if somebody had a big pause in the middle of a conversation that seems weird. You're going to notice it. So, for instance, we have this big block of white space there in that middle column, and that could use some work. Number 9, busy backgrounds. Generally, you want your backgrounds to be negative space, not highly noticeable patterns. So avoid anything in the background that you'll lose foreground elements in. Also, if you do use a repeating pattern or tile for your background, make sure that it blends well and doesn't look like a bunch of individual pieces. Yikes. Yeah, so there's content here, but it's totally lost in the background, which is a tile of some sort of animal. Number 10, tacky type emphasis. You should think twice about doing things like strike through or reversing or making text all caps or underline or whatever. Also, avoid using cute or overused fonts like Comic Sans. So here's a humorous take on what type of dog represents each type of typeface. Comic Sans gets no respect or love, as per usual. Now, I want to make a brief side note about Comic Sans. This is everybody's favorite type to hate. But as it turns out, Comic Sans can actually be very useful for helping people with dyslexia. This was pointed out to me by a student in a previous semester. She was sharing that she was dyslexic and that converting type to Comic Sans made the letters stick together better, as opposed to something like Helvetica, where the letters would slide past one another. I found this fascinating, so I did a little bit of extra research on this, and I found this site for you to read on screen right now. Number 11, bad bullets. Use real bullets for lists. If you have to use graphical elements, make sure that they're consistent with the rest of the design. This very 1990s PowerPoint slide has completely unnecessary fancy bullets. Sort of matches the design, but still kind of looks tacky. Number 12, don't put too much space between the title and the content, or there can be easily, visually disconnected. And finally, number 13, justified rivers. Avoid unsightly rivers of negative space in blocks of text when you justify that type. So in this example, you have all these ribbons of negative space throughout the text, and you really need to tighten that up so that you don't have that, and the text flows a little bit better. So now that we're armed with the knowledge of the 13 design sins, we can see this in action. The first site is just atrocious, but the second one is actually one of the most visited sites at UNI, surprisingly. It's created by an emeritus faculty member, and while the design breaks a lot of the rules we've just talked about, it's absolutely filled to the brim with good content, and so it gets amazing placement in search engines. So again, these are guidelines; they're not hard, fast rules, and certainly you can have a very, very popular site that honestly breaks a lot of these rules that we're teaching about. So you never know. Here's some examples of good design. Okay, so we have sites like Apple and a couple others there, and look at these sites and you'll see that they really do abide by most of those good practices that are kind of the opposite of the design sins.